Hi, I'm Brett Farley with Farley Law, and today let's talk about electronic signatures and deposit accounts. So in January, we did a newsletter on gathering electronic signatures for loans and how that's possible and what some of the guardrails and the considerations are around using electronic signatures with loans. So today, let's talk about electronic signatures and deposits. So a while back, we used to get asked a lot, can you use an electronic signature to open a deposit account? And the answer is yes. I think that's pretty widespread knowledge now, but I think maybe a little bit less widespread knowledge now is how does that work when you're moving from a paper process to an electronic process? So for a long, long time, what banks have done to open deposit accounts is we'll have a depositor show a depositor an account agreement, show the depositor a number of disclosures, then invariably in the process somewhere they'll have the depositor sign a signature card. Now, signature card has changed over time. So it used to be sometimes a very small, maybe 3x5 card or 4x6 card that had an account selection and a signature sample on it. And that's evolved over time. Usually now, what we see is a one-page document. It doesn't vary very much from bank to bank, but usually what's on that signature card is there's a short form W-9 for tax reason where you collect the depositor's tax ID and you collect an attestation that that's the right tax ID. There's a selection of the account type, and then there's a signature sample on the signature card. There might be some other things, but those are the primary items on the signature card. You'll collect some other basic information as well, typically like an account number, an address, maybe a few other things. So the function that the signature card plays typically on paper is you're collecting a tax ID, you're collecting a signature sample, you're collecting an account type, and it's this depositor's signature to the deposit account agreement. So if you're going to move from a paper process to an electronic process, you have to replace the paper signature card. And the first thing that tends to get lost is that signature sample. And there's a way to capture that. We can talk about that in a minute. But when you think about the signature card and you move that to an electronic process, one of the first things that you'll notice, if you really think about it, is the signature card can almost go away. So you do need a signature from the depositor that acknowledges the receipt of disclosures. You need a signature that acknowledges receipt and agreement to the account agreement. You need to collect a W-9. You need to collect identifying information regarding the depositor, but you're not confined necessarily to the same format of the signature card that you've always used. You can use an electronic version of it, and that works really well sometimes. But if there's something about your process that you want to adjust that makes it hard to use a traditional signature card, you don't necessarily need it. There's other ways to work through the process and open a deposit account without having a traditional signature card. So that's one of the main considerations. If you do pull that signature card out, you need to think about what makes up the signature card and make sure you're replacing it in the process with other documents or another method of pulling that information together. So next thing to consider with electronic signatures and deposit accounts is you need to think about consumer versus commercial accounts. For commercial accounts, like we talked about in our January newsletter, you just need the agreement of the business owner or the business to use electronic signatures for the relationship or for that particular contract, and that's not hard to do with an account agreement or with a simple disclosure or add-on to a disclosure. For consumers, is an additional step that you need to add into the process, and that's the eSign consent form that comes from a 2001 law that doesn't have very many teeth. But since then, the CFPB and other regulators have written into our regulations that if you're giving consumer disclosures, you need to have you're giving consumer disclosures electronically. You need to have an eSign consent process built into it. Or if you don't, that becomes a violation of that particular regulation. So thinking about Reg BD, Truth in Savings, thinking about Reg E, Electronic Funds Transfers Act, and a couple others. So if you're opening consumer accounts electronically, you need to think about putting an eSign consent in the process. So what the eSign consent does is really relatively simple. Basically, you're telling the consumer, here's what we'd like to use electronic signatures for, and do you consent to that use? And so you have to tell them a few things along with that. You have to tell them how they're going to sign, what software and hardware they need to use to be able to get electronic documents and to sign electronic documents. You're going to tell them whether or not they have a right to paper documents or an alternative form of delivery of documents. And you'll need to tell them how they can withhold their consent and a couple other things that go into the electronic signature. So the main considerations that tend to come up with e-sign consent are how do we fit that in the process, and how do we write it so that it fits what the bank is trying to do. So by and large, what we usually try to do with the e-sign consent is write it so that the consent applies to the entire consumer relationship with the bank. And so instead of having to collect a consent every time a customer comes in the door to sign something electronically, you can potentially collect it once, unless they withdraw their consent. And then you can collect a number of signatures and deliver a number of documents over the course of a relationship. That really simplifies the process, because then you can take the electronic consent, you can build it into your onboarding process, you can deliver it once, and if you want to be really thorough about it, you deliver it each time the customer takes a major action with respect to an account or opening a loan or something. And then you have a consent that applies across the board, and you can collect electronic signatures a lot more easily. And so you're thinking about, we're going to move from paper to electronic. That's one more thing to insert into the process. And so usually that should come early on, often soon after a login process or soon after an identification process where you've identified the customer, and you put that in place before the rest of the signatures are made. So one of the mistakes that we typically see with the e-sign consent is it's just buried in the documentation, possibly at the end after the consumer's signed a number of documents, and that might cause some problems for you, because effectively what you're trying to do is collect a consent before you deliver electronic documents and not after. And sometimes those steps are confused in the process, and they're mismatched. So last thing to talk about with consumers and electronic signatures is kind of the validity of the signature. And so the obvious thing that comes up with electronic signatures is that the customer isn't necessarily sitting right in front of you. And so you have to have some way to tie the identity of the person to the signature. There's a lot of ways to do that. We'll just talk about a couple that we see pretty commonly. The first is often you'll build in a login process as a customer comes on board, where they'll develop a profile, they'll have a username and a password that's attached to an account with the bank, and then identifying documents and other items can be pulled together and attached to that account, along with an email and phone number and other means of communication, so that as you tie identifying information to the account, you build a solid profile of who the customer is, and you have a really good basket or bucket of proof that you can use to say that this is the person that signed the documents. So for example, if somebody comes to your website, wants to open an account, they're going through an electronic onboarding process. You might have them log in, you might have them submit an ID, you might have them fill out some beneficial ownership information or some identifying information about the customer. You might require them to answer some knowledge-based questions that come in from a credit report. You might require them to submit other pieces of documentation to thoroughly verify that is, in fact, who they are. And so then after you've built kind of this bucket of proof and identification around the person, then you can take the next step of associating all of their subsequent signatures or acknowledgments as they've received the document to that bucket of proof. And so then it's easier to say, yes, this is our customer. Yes, they had all this information. Yes, they had these documents. And so pretty clearly that was that person that signed the document. And so that really helps. So that's electronic signatures for deposit accounts in short form. There's more to go over there. Happy to take questions or comments if you have them. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions on electronic signatures. Thanks.